I do want to get into this ICC attempt to arrest, or at least issue warrants in relation to Benjamin Netanyahu. But let's start with energy. I've just gone through the detailer that AEMO report out today with Graham Lloyd from The Australian. But the blackouts are predicted over summer. They will worsen in coming years. We've got a tanking economy, that's the fear. We're not likely to get the rate falls, the drop in interest rates that people were promised. There's a fear that they'll actually go up. Things are starting to get a little bit tougher, I think, for Australians, and they're already bloody tough. I mean, this is where I think the Prime Minister would seriously be thinking about going to the election early, don't you think, Chris?
Well, certainly if the lights are going out, Peter, you don't want to be the Prime Minister when that happens. And so if you're looking at the calendar, you'd think, well, after the Queensland election in October and before December when summer starts, so sometime in November, might loom as a good time to do it. But then again, think about it, he's probably listening to the advice of his Energy Minister. And if he's doing that, his Energy Minister is going to say, oh, look, they've said this before, that the lights would go out, and they didn't. I don't know if I'd be prepared to take that bigger risk on the advice of Chris Bowen. Don't forget that Chris Bowen was the one who came up with the policies that said by 2025, which is next year, the households will get a $275 saving on their energy bills. And he based that entirely on the idea that when you put more weather-dependent energy on the grid, that is wind and solar, that when it's running, the price is lower and ergo the price drops. Well, I questioned him about that time, and it appeared to me apparent that he didn't understand how electricity is priced on the national energy market, and that is by the highest cost of generation, not the lowest. We did see power prices spike after the war with Russia and Ukraine, but they've come down since then. But that's what pushed up bills last year. What will push them up next is the rollout of transmission lines, which is 40% of your bill, and they have a regulated rate of return. So prices, no matter what you do from now on, they might dip in the short term, but they're going to go up in the long term.
This is like when we talk, budget detail or health funding, let's say. The government's relying on the complexity of this issue. I remember when we were fighting them on the carbon tax, they would just blather on in a whole lot of detail. Voters' eyes would glaze over. They'd tick the box to say, I'm saving the planet. Yeah, I think in a poll, climate change action is a good thing. But when the rubber hits the road and it costs you a lot of money and it sends your business out the back door, that's when you realise that there's got to be a right way to do this transition and there is a wrong way to do this transition. Again, you've just gone through some stuff there. I'm sure people at home didn't understand about the transmission cost now in their bill. Part of the problem here, Chris, with this issue is it's just so complex. And when the government says wind and solar are free, well, you look out there and you see it's sun shining and the wind's blowing, you think that's right, but that's not how our grid works.
Yeah, and the other thing too is we need to start to explain to people how energy systems work. And just think about what happened in the last century. When we went from coal to oil in particular, we saw an explosion of growth, the like of which we have never seen before. In the life of my grandfather, who was born in 1899 and died in the mid-1960s, he started in a house that had no running water, no electricity, and no power of any kind. And by the 1960s, he had a television, a refrigerator, all the things we imagine a modern world has. That is almost entirely due to us finding the most explosive source of energy that we've ever found, and that was oil. Our entire lifestyle has been built on it. What we're doing is going from really energy-dense sources of power, coal, oil and gas, and we're going to dispersed sources of power. What that means is that we have to completely overbuild it. So what you're going to see is we will cover the landscape, literally from sea to shining sea, overbuilding wind and solar power in order to make up for that loss of energy density. And still, even with that, we're going to have to back it up with something because it's not always available. That creates enormous costs. So don't talk about when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. Talk about the actual cost of delivering electricity. And we need to start educating the Australian public as to what that means and what it looks like.
I know you've been up north. I know you're knee deep in this energy. Well, it is a national security issue. Energy is a national security issue. I know you're knee deep in it. What can you tell us? What have you got in the offing?
And we're doing a documentary. It'll go to air in October at this stage, and we're looking at the energy transition, and we're looking at it in a completely dispassionate way. We have no truck with any particular source of power, but where we are and how we're going to get to the land that is promised to us with cheaper energy and greener energy. I was at the Port of Gladstone the other day, and for those who say we will be a green energy superpower based, I think, on hydrogen, but we yet to see that. We haven't got that industry yet. We are already an energy superpower, Peter. Out of that port alone, we export 20% of the world's metallurgical coal and 25% of its liquefied natural gas. Don't forget also that one of the things that we are planning to do is to give up those sources of income. The world demands that we do that. By the way, you can't make wind turbines at the moment without using metallurgical coal because we haven't yet developed the processes for doing that. So we really need to think long and hard about the course which we have set and the costs that that will impose, not just on changing electricity, but changing every single thing that we do. It's a much larger project than people would believe.
When the Prime Minister was asked today about whether he was drawing a moral equivalence, which President Biden did not draw, between Hamas and Israel on the back of the ICC's decision, he sort of said, I'm not going to comment on a court case. Andrew Clennell was scathing of that response from a Prime Minister. He says you don't get to make that call when you're a Prime Minister. You don't get to sit on the fence on something like this. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think that Andrew is right, that the Prime Minister needs to have an opinion. I would have thought that it would be easy to at least say that there is no moral equivalence between the terrorists of Hamas, the death cult of Hamas, and the democratically elected government of Israel. He also said, though, that he doesn't comment on court cases. Well, he has. He's commented on the court case of Julian Assange and has said that it's time that he comes home. And I think that's a perfectly relevant interjection by the Australian Prime Minister to ask the United States to allow that to happen. After all, Julian Assange is an Australian citizen, but he has commented on court cases, so that argument also falls down. But I will say this, Peter, there will be a reckoning with Benjamin Netanyahu because he lives in a democratic society. And I know people who in Israel who are outraged at the fact that he failed at his one major task, because he was a defence hardman, and that was protecting the people of Israel and exposing them to that attack by Hamas. And what's happened is because Hamas cares only slightly more for Palestinians' lives than it does for Israelis' lives, it was inviting Israel to do what we're seeing. It was inviting Israel to come in and to kill as many people as possible in Gaza so that the Israel standing in the world community could fall. So I think as far as Hamas is concerned, if there's not one person left alive after this war, then they'll think that that's a great outcome as long as Israel falls. So I think, yes, there will be a reckoning for Benjamin Netanyahu, but it will be from the people of Israel.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Chris. See you next week.